Welcome to our Constitution Day, where we're going to discuss here at NFC what makes the Constitution tick, where it came from, and what all the deal with all the parts. So, one of the things you have to understand about the Constitution a little bit is its background, where it came from. The Constitution that we have today is actually Constitution 2.0. It's our second attempt at a Constitution. The United States did have a document outlining its national government in the Articles of Confederation. This was a document that was put together by the Continental Congress in the middle of the Revolutionary War, and that government reflected very much the founders' ideas that central government, anything that looked like a king or a monarchy was bad. Anything that reminded them of King George III or of Parliament was bad. Anything that those guys were doing, therefore, it's bad. And so the Articles of Confederation was a very weak central government. It was weak on purpose, though. They made it that way because they thought that those kinds of things were tyrannical and that would crash down on their liberties. And so, for example, there was no executive branch because, an executive kind of reminds them of a monarchy, and monarchies are bad, right? And so there was no judicial branch. They didn't want the central government to have the power of courts over the states. And so those were things that were pulled out of a potential federal government by the Articles of Confederation. But eventually, as we're going to see, the Articles of Confederation proved unworkable. It was too weak, and it would be replaced by the Constitution, where the framers got back together in 1787 and decided, okay, maybe we need to give the federal government a little more power, because if the government's job is to protect your liberty, and if it's too strong, it crushes your liberty, but if it's too weak, it can't protect your liberty. And so that gives us the Constitution that you and I have today. So to ameliorate the fact that we're going to give the Constitution some more power, they wanted to diffuse that. So what they did was they diffused it amongst three branches, right? You've had the legislative branch, which makes the laws, right? The Congress. The judicial branch, which analyzes the actions of the legislature and the executive and then applies those laws to real-world situations with court cases, and then the executive branch, which is the legislature comes up with the laws and the rules and the policies, and then the executive branch says, okay, we're going to put that into action. But they all check each other, right? The legislative branch passes the laws, they spend the money, and the executive branch can veto legislation, and they can also do executive actions on certain things. They are the commander-in-chief of the military. The executive branch can appoint people to various positions in the federal government, but they have to go back to the legislative branch, particularly the Senate, to get advice and consent on many of these things, also on treaties. And of course, the judicial branch can declare acts of either of the other two branches unconstitutional if they feel they went a little too far. With the legislative branch does have an interesting little quirk in that the framers couldn't figure out exactly how to apportion the delegates that would go to it. There was one suggestion to do it by population and just say, hey, all people, all citizens in the country are equal, right? Which we all believe. And so you just send delegates apportioned by population. The problem that some states had with that is, as you've noticed, some states are pretty big, some states are kind of small, and the small states were worried about being outvoted by the large states, and that the large states would just sort of push them around and tell them what to do. Okay, so the other way is, well, some kind of equal representation, right? Every single state has the same number of votes. And of course, then you have the opposite problem, which is, of course, the big states are saying, how come the little states get to have the same say as us? That doesn't seem fair. But on the other hand, right, well, all states are equal, aren't they? And so anyway, the way that they got around this was, why can't we do both, right? And so that's what they're going to do, is the House is going to be apportioned by population. The Senate is going to be apportioned equally. Every state has 2 votes, and then they wash their hands of it. And that's easy. It's like, how's Congress going to be done? This way or that way? Both ways. One in one house, one in the other house, and then we're done, right? What's interesting here is what this does is this creates an interesting situation where we as American citizens actually have dual citizenship. You are citizens of the country. We're citizens of the United States, but we're also a citizen of the state that we're in, and that's something that is kind of interesting, because the states do have a certain level of sovereignty within the United States under the federal government. So the Constitution has a number of purposes. I've hinted at these a little bit before. One is to defend the individual's liberty. This was something that harkens all the way back to the American Revolution and the notion that the purpose of government is to defend people's rights and liberties, and that when, for example, the government of England failed to defend people's liberties, and actually, as the framers would argue, attacked people's liberties, then you could get rid of that government. And so the new government that they were going to create with the U.S. Constitution, that's going to have that as its purpose, is to defend individuals' liberties, right? Well, what's the best way to defend someone's liberty? Well, they determined that a union of the states was the best way to do that, right? The states get together, they cooperate on defensive measures, they share resources, and so that was what was determined would be the best way to defend an individual's liberty. And so, therefore, the Constitution, one of its jobs, one of its purposes, is to preserve this union of states. Also, to an interesting side of the Constitution is it has some democratic features and some anti-democratic features. It is democratic in the sense that, for the most part, majority rules, right? If you get a majority vote in Congress, you can kind of do what you want, but then the Constitution reminds us up to a point, right? Because there's also minority protections in the U.S. Constitution, which is just because you get a majority doesn't mean that you can do just whatever you want. So, for example, constitutional amendments do require that you get a 2/3 majority in either Congress or the states to propose one, and then a 3/4 majority in the states in order to ratify one. So that is something that if you want to do big changes, then you have to get a supermajority. You have to get most people to agree to go along with that. Just a simple majority isn't enough. This is going to be an interesting way that the United States is going to avoid many of the big problems that, for example, the French would have when they set up their own democratic republic. And they got a bare majority and they started going at each other and then eventually guillotining each other like crazy in the streets. And well, we voted for it. We got a majority. The Constitution posits the idea that a simple majority for the really huge things is not really enough. That minority protections should be there. So, for example, getting a bare majority of people that say, okay, if you say certain things we don't like, then you should shut up. And the Constitution says, no, you've got freedom of speech. You need to amend the Constitution in order to get that changed, which of course is going to require a supermajority. So we talked about rights and liberties. What exactly are they? How exactly do they work? How do they fit into the Constitution, right? What's interesting is the Bill of Rights, which now we regard as one of the enshrined bits of the Constitution, and people all across the political spectrum, left, right, they refer back to the Bill of Rights, right? The Bill of Rights, actually, interestingly enough, was an early sticky point. It wasn't in the first draft of the Constitution that was sent to the states for ratification, because as you'll notice, there are amendments 1 through 10, right? And the reason that they weren't in was the framers of the Constitution didn't like the idea of rights and liberties being limited to a list. They didn't like that thought. They were very much of the idea that, your rights and liberties, everyone knows what they are, and they're broad and they're expansive, and basically anything that doesn't infringe on anybody else, well, that's your right. And then there you go, right? That's just how it goes, right? So, but the states, particularly Massachusetts, were like, well, hang on, we want a Bill of Rights in there. We want some clear, listed guarantees of rights that the new federal government can't infringe on. And so the framers were like, okay, I tell you what, you just ratify it and we'll add it to the Constitution. And that's, hopefully you're sitting down. A bunch of politicians promised something and then they actually did it. One of the first things that the Congress took up once it went into effect was to add the Bill of Rights and propose it to the states for this, right? So the question is, what is a right? Do you have a right to do something? Do you have a right to do whatever you feel like? The concept that most of the early framers had was that basically anything that you wanted to do that didn't hurt anybody else was pretty much fair game. This also not only included your sort of personal activity, like freedom of speech, right? Your freedom of religion, but also to your economic activity. The idea that you could own property and that you had a reasonable expectation that nobody else was just going to, walk along and swipe it. So this was the rights, and this was how they were sort of conceived. What isn't a right? Basically, anything that required somebody else to give up something of their own is not a right. So, for example, the freedom to speak is not the same thing as the freedom to be heard. You may have the right to say what you want, but you don't have the right to force anybody to listen, right? So you're out protesting for whatever political cause that you want, and as long as you're not blocking traffic or whatever, the government's not supposed to stop you, right, from that. It's like you can't say that. That's not good. You're embarrassing our politicians. They don't like it, right? They're not supposed to do that. You got the freedom to say what you want. That doesn't mean you can run down the street and tackle people and hold them down and be like, you're going to listen to my political, ideas. Yeah, you don't really have a right to do that, right? So anything that really requires you to take something away from another person usually isn't considered a right. So how does a government protect your rights? Well, in the barest senses, right, it protects it physically, right? When somebody comes along and tries to prevent you from exercising your rights, cops are supposed to stop them. Same thing is true for property rights. When somebody comes to try to steal your car, the expectation that we have is that you call the cops and they're hopefully going to try to get it back. Whether you're satisfied that will actually happen, that is the way that it's supposed to happen. People are not just supposed to be able to come and take your stuff with that. So these are the ways that the government can protect your rights physically, but also too they can protect them legally, right? The court system is designed to look at people's rights and say, okay, are their rights being defended? Are they being attacked by the government, a government action, by another citizen or a group of citizens, and they are supposed to step in and protect you, right? So when we talk about the federal system, right? When we talk about the federal system, the false idea that we have is that sort of the U.S. government sits on top and tells the states, kind of what to do. There is a certain amount of truth in this, in that the United States government's laws and rulings are supreme, but really it's much closer to this, which is more like a Venn diagram rather than a pyramid, where the states have some powers that they exercise, and the U.S. government has some powers that they exercise. And you'll notice that they've got some that are unique to each. So for the United States government, they handle defense. So the state of Florida should not declare war on Brazil all on its own. They're not supposed to do that, right? Now, they do have National Guards for internal emergencies that can be federalized for national emergencies, but that's how the United States government is going to work with defense, in the same way with treaties, right? The United States government engages in treaties and not individual states. Individual states can work out agreements with other countries, but they're not binding national treaties. Also, basically anything that involves more than one state. If it's a multi-state issue like interstate commerce, interstate communications, one state suing another state over water rights, then that goes into the realm of the United States government. The states, on the other hand, they have several of their proclivities that are unique to them. So, for example, local government, counties and cities. Now, while counties and cities can't go against U.S. law, their actual governance are handled by the states and not by the federal government. The federal government can't step in and say, this county here in Florida is it's messed up. You need to get rid of it. You need to absorb it into the other county. Yeah, the federal government can't really do that, okay? Education is another one that the states will establish on their own, how they want to educate their students, how, who has to go to school when, for how long, what exactly are going to be the requirements, what are they going to study, will there be charter schools, do we want to set up for a special school for kids that want to learn ballet? I don't know, right? Education is really up to the states. Also, the states are the ones that handle elections, right? Even federal elections, which states do have to conform to the rules that federal elections handle themselves by, but unless they break those rules, the states can determine how those elections occur. And there are going to be some powers, and this isn't an exhaustive list, right? There are some powers that are shared by both, such as taxation. The United States government can levy taxes, so can the state government. The United States government can pass laws, rules that we have to abide by. So can the states. And so those are ways in which the federal government actually operates. Like I said, there is the supremacy of U.S. law, but really it operates on a day-to-day basis, more like a Venn diagram than a pyramid. Now, while we like to hold up the Constitution as a great example because it's lasted since the 1780s with its ratification, that doesn't mean that there haven't been some major controversies as the decades have turned into centuries. So One of the early blind spots in the federal Constitution was, let's say Congress passes a law that goes against the Constitution. How would we solve that problem? Who decides whether a law passed by Congress is constitutional or not? Some of the early framers, sort of in thinking about this, they were like, well, that's really the role of the presidential veto, right? The president looks at a law that Congress has passed, and then it sends it to his desk, and he's like, I think this goes against the Constitution. I'm going to veto it. And that kind of held in place for a long time until Andrew Jackson, the 7th president, came along, and he was the first one to really veto something just because he didn't like it. This is now normal, right? If you've got, for example, a Republican president and a Democrat Congress, and they pass something and he doesn't like it, he just vetoes it, right? Or the other way around. If you got a Democrat president and Republicans in Congress pass something and the president doesn't like it, be like, you bunch of squirrely so-and-sos, I'm just going to veto it, right? That's pretty normal now. Up until Andrew Jackson, though, that would have been really abnormal. So the question was, what if Congress passed some law and you think that it violates the principles of the Constitution? Thomas Jefferson, one of the arguments that he made in the late 1790s was the states. The states had the ability to just simply nullify a federal law, right? They just said, that law, that doesn't apply here in whatever state. And of course, the problem with that is then U.S. law is not supreme. U.S. law essentially, serves at the pleasure of the states, which is not a good way to have a system. Any law that's passed that all the states want except one, and then the one's like, yeah, you guys can't do it here because we don't like it in this state, so we're just not going to follow it. So that's a problem. The way that we do it now is, of course, the Supreme Court handles this. They weigh in on a matter and they say, okay, this law that you guys passed, the president signed it, or you overrode his veto or whatever. Yeah, it's unconstitutional. It goes against the Constitution. You can't do that. Okay, that is not a power that is delegated to the Supreme Court in the Constitution. The court just took it on themselves. They said, well, it's kind of implied. That's what courts do, and everybody just kind of rolled with it. It was from the 1805 case Marbury versus Madison, which was the first exercise of judicial review, this process of saying that a law is constitutional or not. And everybody just kind of, okay, it sounds good. And so we've since, gone with it. The problem, of course, with that is when you get, some of these very controversial Supreme Court decisions, a lot of people ask the question of, well, where do we go if we get a Supreme Court decision we don't like? Because if you get a bad ruling out of Congress, right? You just vote new people into Congress. Or if you get some bad action out of the president, you just vote in a new president. The problem with the Supreme Court is, you can't vote them in and out. They're appointed by the president, they're confirmed by the Senate, and of course, Supreme Court decisions are supposed to be kind of permanent. So, yeah, that's something that actually still is very sticky with us today. One of the big issues that existed, fortunately we get to use the past tense on this one, was slavery. And slavery, the real crux of the problem with slavery was that you try to do two things at once, right? It created a paradox, which was, are slaves people? Are they going to be governed as people, right? Or are they property, which means that they're owned and bought and sold? Well, they try to do both, and that's part of the problem, right? Because when you treat a slave as property, right, then the property owner, the slave owner, has property rights and an expectation of those rights are going to come into play, such as if you come along and is like, hey, I really don't like slaves or slavery, it's no good. Hey, slave guy, come with me and I'll help you get away, right? Well, you're stealing that guy's property, and that guy who owned them in terms of property has every expectation to call the law and be like, yeah, I don't know, this guy, Bobby, he stole my slave. Go get him back. And that's what would happen, right? You have slave catchers that would go and would do this. But the other side of this was when slaves would, kill somebody for whatever reason, they would be put on trial, and they would be, if they were convicted, they would be hung, or they would be sentenced to whatever punishment it was for that crime. And that's not what you do to property. You don't, and you can have living property. You can own a horse or a dog or something like that. And if your dog bites somebody, they don't put the dog in jail. They go after the owner and they say, hey, you should have tied up your dog, or put him in a fence or something like that. And he's been biting people, and you're responsible because the dog is property. So it created this really awkward paradox. And of course, the Constitution tried to split the difference on this. That, well, slaves are property, but they should also be counted as people. They're 3/5 of a person. And the reason for that, of course, was the South got wind of the fact that the North was saying, "Hey, under the new government, we can tax. We can tax, and what we can do is we can just simply tax slavery." And so to counter that, the South was like, "All right, give us the representation, so to balance it out." The tax never happened, right? The tax never passed in the Congress, but what did happen was the 3/5 clause to try to balance it out, to try to balance out something that wound up never happening. So this created a whole jumble, which was finally, just solved with emancipation in 1865, right? So one of the other controversies that really started in the early couple of decades of the 1900s, and that was when we look at the Constitution, how do we want to construct it? How do we want to think about it? Is it an immutable object that we can only use it to reflect the ideas that are explicitly stated in them, or do we treat it like a living, breathing document, right? That it grows and evolves with the times, right? And that we sort of use it as a kind of a historical marker, but we don't actually stick to it. Versus the people that say, no, you stick to the original intent, and if you want to make changes to it, you have to make constitutional amendments. You'll see that Woodrow Wilson, who was president in the 19-teens, was the one who really brought in this idea of living constitution. The Constitution is an old document. I mean, it was written in the 1700s, and so maybe we should have a more updated, more sort of loose view of the Constitution. Versus then, of course, guys later on like Ronald Reagan, Associate Justice Antonin Scalia of the Supreme Court, who were like, no, you stick to its original intent. Right? What did the words mean when they wrote it? How exactly was this always constructed? And you stick to that. And you don't. If you want to make changes, you have to make changes through the amendment process. So those are some of the early controversies, right, that continue to go with us. And then let's talk about one that's a little more recent, and that is abortion. Right? This is from a 1973 court case, and this, of course, still wildly controversial, right? And the Constitution, for example, Amendment 5 states very explicitly that your life, your liberty, and your property are protected, right? So your life, you're protected to be alive. Somebody tries to come and kill you, the government's supposed to step in, right? They're supposed to try to protect your life. The question, of course, with abortion is, what is life? When does it begin? How does it deal with it? Whether or not the Roe v. Wade court decision that allowed for legal abortions in the United States, was it properly adjudicated? Was it good law? And there's arguments back and forth on one side or the other, right? So it creates a number of problems for people to deal with. All right, so we get to the point where we have Constitution fun, right? We talk about some of these trivial points of the Constitution. And you guys can just buzz in, right, on the channel here whenever you have the answer. Can a state, this is for a presidential election, can a state designate its tallest citizens to serve as electors for president instead of having a popular vote? So I think we have, 27 electors in Florida. However many we have, 27, 29 that we have. Let's say that we have 27, right? And the state legislature says, okay, our electors are going to be the tallest, the 27 tallest Floridians. We're going to measure them, and whoever the tallest ones are, that's going to be. And then they will go to the Electoral College, and they will cast their vote for who they want to be president. And if you say, is that fair? Is that legit? Right? Can you do that? Actually, yeah. The Constitution says that the states shall determine their own method for choosing electors. Now, all 50 states have chosen some kind of popular vote, though. Most of them have a winner-take-all system, which is whoever gets the most votes in their state gets all the electors for the pledged electors for that person to show up at the Electoral College and say, I'm going to vote for this person, or I'm going to vote for that person. But you can do it the other way. Right? This came about in 2000 when Al Gore and George W. Bush went into recount madness here in Florida over, well, who exactly won the states? I think at that point it was 25 electoral college votes, because whoever was going to win them was going to be president of the United States. Right? And so eventually, and then it's recount. There was court cases back and forth, and eventually, the state legislature of Florida, which was Republican controlled, they said, okay, look, the clock is running out. We got to have a president by January. We got to have, the Electoral College meets in a few weeks, and so they were just going to have a vote, and they were just going to appoint the Republican electors, and a lot of the Democrats, of course, got very angry, understandably so, and they're like, you can't do that, and they were like, yeah, Constitution, we can just do whatever we want. We're the state legislature, so that's how you can do it. Do you have a right to vote? Well, that one seems obvious. Yeah? Yeah? No. Maybe I should put a question mark after the no. Now, in nowhere in the Constitution is it stated that it will protect a citizen's right to vote. It doesn't say that anyone has the right to vote. And in fact, it says that it is the states who shall determine who gets to vote or not. The only modifiers to this are the 15th, 19th, and 26th Amendments, which say that states cannot use race, gender, or age, meaning over 18, as factors. So the states can determine who can and can't vote, but they can't say, oh, well, you can't vote because you're black. Can't do that, right? Everybody can vote except for women, right? Sorry, women, you can't vote, right? They can't do that. They're not allowed to do that. And states cannot make you wait longer than your 18th birthday to be able to vote, okay? Now, the states want to lower it, and some states, every once in a while, they talk about lowering it to, say, 16 or something like that. They can do that, but they can't make you wait longer than that. So if you want to construe that you maybe have a right to vote, it's never been supported by the courts. So, for example, some states, if you commit a felony, you get stripped of your voting privileges, and some states will restore them after you get out of prison. Some states, like up until recently, Florida, you had to go through a long process to have your voting rights restored. And some states, they let you keep voting even when you're in prison, right? Your voting rights are never stripped away. And so it's up to the states to determine who can and can't vote, and it's not a federally protected right. So let's say you're going to amend the Constitution. What role does the president play? Right? So you would think that you want to get a president like on your side for whatever your amendment is, right? Right. So what specifically does the president do during the amendment process? Let's see. Spectator. Yeah, the president actually doesn't do anything in the amendment process. He can propose amendments, but then again, so can I. So can you. Anybody can propose an amendment. You just get online. They're like, here's a good amendment to the Constitution, right? And a lot of people do this. I've seen guys that they write books on, hey, I propose these amendments to the Constitution, and these are the reasons why. Cool, right? The only people who can get involved are Congress and the states. Congress can propose amendments through a 2/3 vote of both houses, but only the states can ratify the amendments through a 3/4 vote. In fact, if the states wanted to, they can amend the Constitution all by themselves, right? They can propose an amendment with a 2/3 vote of the states, or they can call for a 2/3 vote to have a constitutional convention to propose amendments, and then a 3/4 vote either in that convention or with the state legislatures. And so that's if the states want to do it by themselves, but the president, other than giving table thumping speeches, not really involved at all. So, Constitution, like ours, lasted a long time. How long do you think it is? Right? How long do you think that it is, particularly in comparison to other countries' constitutions? Right? So you got a big country like the United States, 2 oceans, Alaska, Hawaii, a bunch of territories, right? All this kind of stuff's lasted for hundreds of years. How long do you think the Constitution is? Let's give a guess. It is the world's shortest Constitution. Yeah, the original draft was only 4,400 words. Or, if you're one of your professors, maybe your government professor or an English professor or maybe even a history professor, who knows, and you get tasked with a term paper assignment, and they say, okay, I want you to write a draft for a constitution. I want you to draft a constitution for a country that you know will work. It'll work. You got to have one to work. And so let's say you cut and paste the original draft of the U.S. Constitution, you're still going to be a page short on a 10-page term paper. You have to come up with some more, right? Maybe you throw in a Bill of Rights or something like that later. But yeah, that's where the U.S. Constitution is. Does the U.S. Constitution create a democracy? You have to think about what a democracy is, how the Constitution works. So you're getting tested on your government terms. So is it? What do you think? I don't know. Technically speaking, no. All right. The type of government that the Constitution creates is called a republic, or people ruling themselves indirectly through elected officials. A democracy, and you'll notice that in the question, all right, I gave you a little hint. I capitalized the D in democracy, right? Meaning that it is some specific type of government. A democracy is where people vote on everything themselves, right? We'd all be in Congress, right? We'd all have to vote, via the internet or something like that on every single thing that the government was doing all the time. So, for example, the Athenians had a democracy, right? That was how they did things. You had to get enough people in the forum to vote on things. What do you think we should do? We should do this. All right. You think no? And so that's what you had to do. You had to do with this all this kind of stuff, right? And so that was how they did things. If you just mean democracy as a colloquial term, right? Because the word democracy, right, comes from the Greek demokratia, which means power to the people. If you think the people have the power in the country, okay, then sure, it's a democracy. But technically speaking, in precise terms, no, it is not a democracy. Can the states make sweeping changes to the Constitution without Congress's permission? We talked about this before. Check your memory. And yeah, but it does take a considerable hurdle to get them to do it by themselves. 2/3 of the states can call for a constitutional convention. If they vote and they say, hey, we need a constitutional convention, we need to talk about some changes to the Constitution, any proposed changes must pass 3/4 of the states. So if this situation were to arise, Congress can stay at their beach houses if they like. The three branches, we talk about them as being equal. There is one branch that does have a tie-breaking power and thus can be considered the strongest. Which one of the three do you think it is, and how is it that they have the tie-breaking power? It's Congress, right? The original conception of the Constitution was that Congress would kind of take the lead on everything, right? We're now more executive kind of focused, like who the president is and what they're doing. But that was the concept early. And Congress has one power that neither of the other two can really touch, and that's the impeachment power, right? If Congress wanted to, they could just impeach the snot out of anybody that gets in their way in the other branches. But you do need 2/3 majorities in the Senate to get the job done, right? Where you need a majority in the House to impeach, to bring somebody up on charges, and then you need a 2/3 vote in the Senate to get rid of them. Not only does this include the president, but it includes the vice president, it includes the members of the Supreme Court and the federal courts. And so if Congress decided, hey, we're doing this right here, and the other two branches like, I don't think that we're going to stop you. And if enough people in Congress were like 100% sure that they were doing what they should be doing, then they can just impeach everybody that's in their way and get rid of them until eventually they have people in place that are going to be more compliant. And so that's something that they do have. But of course, Congress is diffused with the most members, right? So we reached the end of this. This is where I would normally give a question and answer session. But since this is a canned video, I'm not going to sit here. I'm really not going to sit here and wait for you guys to ask me questions. So that's Constitution Day for this year. Hopefully you guys have a great day celebrating our Constitution.